It's a warm, humid morning on the temperate island of Saipan, the largest of the Mariana Islands. The date, June 15th, 1944. An amphibious fleet led by Lieutenant General Holland Smith is soon to overwhelm the sandy beaches of the island's southwestern coast. This island, populated by over 25,000 Japanese citizens, will soon become a decimated battleground of tropic warfare. The bloody hellscape soon to follow is reflected in the final letters of Japanese serviceman Tarawa Kawaguchi. Since the enemy landing, to have fought against the enemy, endeavoring my utmost power in carrying out my duty and thus becoming a war god, I am very happy. It is only regrettable that we have not fought enough and that the American devil is stomping on the imperial soil. I, with my sacrificed body, will become the Whitecaps of the Pacific, and will stay on this island until the friendly forces come to reclaim the soil of the Emperor. July 7th, 1944. To my aunt and uncle, thanks for your long hospitality. I regret that I cannot repay you. I firmly believe that the enemy will be annihilated and will pray for certain victory over the imperial land. These here were the final words of Tarawa Kawaguchi, another lost soul in the War of the Pacific. The nation of Japan, once shrouded in isolation, has become an imperial power of the East. Under Emperor Hirohito's rule, the Japanese army is taught to fight by one principle: sacrifice. In Japan, to die in combat for the emperor was seen as an honor, making the Japanese soldiers formidable bonsai warriors. Seeking raw materials to fuel its growing industries, Japan invaded the Chinese province of Manchuria in 1931, renaming it to Manchukuo. By 1937, Japan controlled large sections of China, and war crimes against the Chinese became commonplace. The Whole Note was the final proposal delivered to the Empire of Japan by the United States of America before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The note, delivered on November 26, 1941, repeats previous American demands for Japan to withdraw from China and French Indochina. On December 1st, an imperial conference sanctioned the war against the United States, United Kingdom, and Kingdom of the Netherlands. It was perceived as an ultimatum. The Pacific War began as Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Hideki Tojo, known as the Commissary, is an excellent military leader. Tojo adopted an aggressive stance in conducting preemptive strikes against China and Russia. In 1937, the Japanese provoked the Chinese into a full-scale war with the Marco Polo Bridge incident. On July 22, 1940, Tojo was appointed War Minister by Prime Minister Kano. The Second Sino-Japanese War continued, and Tojo was instrumental in performing the alliance between Japan, Germany, and Italy. On October 18, 1941, Tojo was named the 40th Prime Minister of Japan. Japan's expansionist philosophies, which were heavily influenced by Tojo, eventually led to the economic sanctions and oil embargo conducted by several Western powers, including the United States and Britain. April 1942. General Douglas MacArthur consolidated his units to fight against the Japanese army. By this time, the Japanese controlled nearly all of Southeast Asia. It was a 3-month-long battle beginning on January 7, 1942. Immediately after began the Bataan Death March. The march was a transfer by the Imperial Japanese Army of 80,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war. Prisoners were forced to march until they died. There were 5,000 to 18,000 Filipino deaths, and 500 to 650 American deaths during the march. The march was characterized by severe physical abuse and killings. Any man that stumbled was shot dead. The Doolittle Raid. James Harold Doolittle was born in Alameda, California, on December 14, 1896. Doolittle served in the United States Army Air Corps. In 1922, he made the first cross-continental crossing in less than 24 hours. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Army Air Corps when he led the raid on Japan that revitalized the American people who were reeling from the Japanese attack. During the raid, all 16 of his bombers were lost. He and his own crew, along with the crews of 9 other B-25s, bailed out over China and made their way to safety. 1 man was killed bailing out over China, and 2 others drowned trying to swim a lake to escape capture by Japanese occupation forces. Of the 8 crewmen captured in China, 3 were executed. The remaining 5 were given life sentences, and 1 of them died of starvation. 3 additional crews survived crash landings on the China coast and reached safety. The banzai tactics of the Japanese army were best demonstrated in the Battle of Saipan. Japan held strong commitments to the island, seeing Saipan as one of its last lines of defense. The battle ranged from June 15th to July 9th, 1944, and was one of the major campaigns of World War II. The United States landed on the island's southwestern coast. The battle reached its climax on July 7th. On that day, General Yoshitsugu Saito and some 4,300 troops, strapped for munitions and surrounded by Americans, led the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. The Japanese overran the 105th Regiment, continued down the coastal plain, and attacked a 10th Marine Artillery Battery positioned behind the 105th. The Marines were firing their 105mm howitzers line of sight directly on the oncoming waves of Japanese troops, but they still kept coming. The Marines destroyed their guns and they fell back. This attack continued for some 12 hours before the Japanese were wiped out. The Japanese had advanced over 1,000 yards before they were stopped. Some 105th Regiment soldiers who were cut off by the Japanese were forced to swim to U.S. destroyers offshore to survive. After more than 3 weeks of heavy fighting, the Americans captured the island. The weapons and the tactics of close-quarter fighting resulted in high civilian casualties. Some 20,000 Japanese civilians perished during the battle, including over 1,000 who jumped from Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff to avoid being taken prisoner. With the capture of Saipan, the American military was only 1,300 miles from the Japanese home islands. This loss of Saipan was a heavy blow to both the military and civilian administration of Japanese Prime Minister Tojo, who was forced to resign. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted from February 19th to March 26, 1945. It was a major battle in which the United States captured the island of Iwo Jima from the Imperial Japanese Army. The American invasion, designated Operation Detachment, had the purpose of capturing the island with 2 airfields, South Field and Central Field. The 5-week battle saw some of the fiercest and bloodiest fighting of the Pacific War. Ten days after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Rear Admiral Nimitz was selected to be the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet. Assuming command at the most critical period of the war in the Pacific, Admiral Nimitz organized his forces to halt the Japanese advance despite the shortage of ships, planes, and supplies. He had a significant advantage since the United States had cracked the Japanese diplomatic naval code. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had kept radio silence, but now events were moving so rapidly that they had to rely on coded radio messages that were read by Americans in Hawaii. In 1945, Nimitz's forces launched successful amphibious assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But how did these battles start? On March 31st, 1945, the eve of the Allied landing at Okinawa, a Japanese kamikaze struck the USS Indianapolis, killing 9 sailors. The ship was carrying uranium core for atomic bombs. The USS Indianapolis went down in a mere 12 minutes, bringing nearly 300 of her crew down with her. As she disappeared beneath the waves, some of the ship's crew floated in the Pacific Ocean, their location unknown to the U.S. Navy. Sharks attacked some of the survivors who had floated away from the larger groups. So a crew member, Harlan Twibble, organized shark watches to keep the men together and fend off the sharks. After 4 days and 5 nights, the survivors were finally sighted by a U.S. naval aircraft on routine patrol. Of the 900 men that went into the water, only 316 survived to be rescued. The Battle of Okinawa, from April 1st, 1945 to June 22nd, 1945. The Battle of Okinawa was a major battle of the Pacific War fought on the island of Okinawa. The initial invasion of Okinawa on April 1st, 1945 was the largest amphibious assault on the Pacific theater for World War II. The Allies were planning to use Kadena Air Base on the large island of Okinawa as a base for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands 340 miles away. The American side lost many civilians, including journalist Ernie Pyle. Pyle had become popular in the States due to his earnest writing style as a war correspondent. His loss was felt in every American home. After the battle, Okinawa provided the necessary proximity to Japan for the U.S. forces in preparation for a planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. American bombing raids on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked the first use of atomic weapons in war.
Roger. Release the bomb. Releasing bomb.
Tens of thousands were killed in the initial explosion, and many more would later succumb to radiation poisoning. The first objective, of course, was to bring the war with Japan to a speedy end and spare American lives. It has been suggested that the second objective was to demonstrate the new weapon of mass destruction to the Soviet Union. A uranium bomb, codenamed Little Boy, detonated over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and had an explosive yield equal to 15,000 tons of TNT. A slightly larger plutonium bomb, codenamed Fat Man, exploded over Nagasaki 3 days later and leveled 6.7 square kilometers. In Hiroshima, 90% of physicians and nurses were killed or injured. 12 of 45 hospitals were rendered non-functional, and 70% of victims had combined injuries, including in most cases, severe burns. On August 8, 1945, 2 days after the U.S. dropped its first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, the Soviet Union officially declared war on Japan. The Soviets under Joseph Stalin had earlier promised a formal war declaration against Japan 3 months after the defeat of Nazi Germany. But there are growing concerns that the Soviets are positioning themselves for a communist expansion in Asia, most notably the Korean Peninsula.